In 2020, a set of Soviet files, sealed away since the height of the Cold War, came to light. The documents describe pressurized laboratories that could survive in outer space, vehicles capable of traveling across celestial bodies for days, and systems that could protect crews beneath layers of lunar soil. The Soviets weren't only planning to beat America and land on the moon first. They were planning to stay. Spread across the dozens of documents on the Soviet space programs released in recent years, USSR scientists lay out the space technology they were developing at the time, along with detailed discussions of when and how it should be launched, so the Americans could never outshine them. In one file, Sergei Afanasyev, Soviet Minister of General Machine Building, demands to hold deployment of probes until scientists are certain that will carry out their task to perfection, warning, quote, "If it turns out that the machine successfully landed, but started gathering moon atmosphere instead of soil, it would be an embarrassment." In another document, dated June 19, 1967, Soviet planners described the development of lunar bases where scientists could carry out operations on the surface of the moon. At first, these outposts would only be temporary, but over time, they were meant to grow larger and more permanent. There were even plans for a future lunar observatory, from which Soviet crews could observe Earth and every single celestial object surrounding it. Today, such a plan might sound almost childish, but at the dawn of the space race, with billions of dollars pouring in and some of the brightest minds on Earth being recruited into the program, the entire solar system was within reach. And the Soviets were about to beat the Americans in claiming it for themselves. The US knew it was in trouble as early as 1957. On October 4th, at a launch site in Kazakhstan, an R-7 Semyorka rocket ignited. American officials had already been hearing unsettling reports about this weapon. The R-7 was the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, designed to carry a nuclear warhead more than 5,500 miles, far enough to put most of the United States within reach. But the Soviets had no intention of raining fire over America, at least not yet. Instead, as the rocket launched, it kept climbing higher and higher until it vanished into the sky. Then, near low Earth orbit, its engines cut out, and from the tip emerged a polished metal sphere with 4 long antennae. Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite in history, was now circling the Earth. America could not let its Cold War enemy take the lead so easily. In 1958, the nation created NASA and began launching probes set to travel far beyond the atmosphere. The US space program had officially started. However, many of the scientists recruited couldn't shake a heavy question hanging over them. What if they were already too late? In 1959, the US launched Pioneer 4, hoping to photograph the moon. The probe managed to break free from Earth's gravity, but as it approached the lunar surface, it missed by too wide a margin for its scanner to work. The Soviets responded with Luna 2 and Luna 3, a space duo that shortly after Pioneer 4's failure became the first human-made objects to reach the moon and photograph its far side, respectively. American officials could only look up at the sky with clenched fists. They were supposed to be the ultimate technological leaders of the post-war world, yet their former allies were constantly upstaging them. In 1961, America sent Alan Shepard into space. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it felt like second place, because just weeks earlier, Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin had already done it first and gone farther, staying up nearly 2 hours and completing a full orbit of the Earth, while Shepard's flight lasted barely 15 minutes. Still, giving up was not an option. President John F. Kennedy made it clear, quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." It didn't matter if by 1966, Luna 9 achieved the first soft landing on the moon, beating the Americans by about 4 months. It was irrelevant when, in 1968, the Soviet Zone 5 had brought terrestrial life closer to the moon than anyone had ever achieved before, carrying a crew of tortoises, insects, and seeds. The American space race would simply not change course. However, if the US was actually going to live up to Kennedy's words, there was only one way forward: to make a Faustian bargain with an ominous scientist who had once been one of the US's most wanted. It may not have been an ideal scenario, But if doing so meant stopping the Soviets from securing lunar real estate before the Americans and preventing the moon from turning into the latest communist stronghold, then so be it. The scientist was Werner von Braun, a German genius who had once worked for a man named Adolf Hitler. Under the rule of the Third Reich, he helped the Nazis build some of the most advanced missiles the world had ever seen, including the V-2 rocket, one of the Führer's so-called vengeance weapons. It could fly 3 times the speed of sound and climb high enough to brush the edge of space. Many would later argue that von Braun should have been treated as a criminal. Yet after the war, he insisted that working for Hitler had never been a matter of loyalty. Under Nazi rule, a scientist simply had no other choice. And as he would later describe, to him, his former boss was, quote, only a pompous fool with a Charlie Chaplin mustache. Under Operation Osoaviakim, the Soviets had deported thousands of German scientists to the USSR to help boost its rocket program. America could not just let its rival have all the top talent, so for many officials, von Braun's justification was good enough. And not long after Germany's fall, he was on a one-way flight to the US. By the early 1960s, von Braun had risen to become one of NASA's most influential figures, working alongside Kurt Debus, yet another German engineer brought to the United States after the war. He began designing the machine that could finally push America ahead in the space race, a rocket that would soon be known as Saturn V. It was unlike anything von Braun had ever built for the Third Reich. Standing 363 feet tall, it rose slightly higher than the Statue of Liberty, but its true power lay beneath the surface. With massive F1 and J2 engines working together across 3 stages, Saturn V could hurl more than 2,400 tons of machinery and fuel toward space, becoming the first truly operational super heavy launch vehicle in history. By 1969, the American rocket had already flown 5 times, including a crewed mission that carried astronauts all the way to orbit the moon. The Soviets rushed to catch up, but now it was they who were struggling. They too had been building their own giant moon rocket, known as the N1, but every time they tried to launch it, something went wrong. During the first test, a malfunction in the rocket's control system began shutting down engines seconds after liftoff, while a fuel leak ignited an internal fire that doomed the booster. The second launch was even worse. On July 3, 1969, just moments after liftoff, a liquid oxygen turbopump exploded, triggering a chain reaction of failures. Engines shut down, the rocket lost thrust, tilted sideways, and fell back onto the launch pad. Just a couple of weeks later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were already walking across the surface of the moon, planting the American flag in the lunar dust. It was official. The Soviets had led the race for years, only to stumble at the very last moment. Still, the game was not over. The USSR might not be the first nation to place a man on the moon, but there was still a chance to turn Earth's satellite into a Soviet base, a mission that even today hasn't been forgotten. Even before the Americans landed on the moon, the Soviets had already approved a major study known as the Galaktika program, which, besides asking scientists to analyze the feasibility of sending crews to Venus and Mars, also tasked teams with devising the most efficient way to establish permanent settlements on the lunar surface. The bulk of these efforts fell to the Design Bureau of General Machine Building, or KBOM, led by Soviet engineer Vladimir Barman. Throughout his career, he had served as one of the principal designers behind some of the Soviet Union's earliest rocket launch complexes. If there was a man who knew how to assemble a moon outpost, it was him. The first mock-ups for the station began surfacing around the late 1960s and early 70s, after KBOM was authorized to bring in teams of design and calculation specialists to turn the idea of a Soviet moon base into a working concept. The findings were eventually published in a report known as Principles of the Construction of Long-Functioning Lunar Settlements. In it, Barman's team described a settlement that would initially house only 4 crew members, but which could eventually expand into a lunar base capable of supporting as many as a dozen Soviet astronauts, each expected to remain on the moon for up to a year at a time. It was not entirely clear what this pioneering Space Corps would be tasked with upon arriving at the station. However, according to the KBOM papers, the complex would include an astronomy laboratory and a garage housing a fleet of lunar rovers, capable of covering up to 155 miles of terrain in a single mission while sustaining their crews for up to 2 weeks. This suggests that these first lunar colonists might have spent their days conducting astronomical observations beneath the perfectly black, atmosphere-free sky, while also venturing across the moon's vast plains and crater landscapes to study its geology and determine whether it could support further development. Plans for the base even mentioned equipment for material lifting and construction, hinting that this outpost was meant to be the foundation for something much larger. During their off hours, Soviet astronauts could retreat to their new home within the station's main living facilities. These quarters were expected to be buried beneath the lunar soil to shield the crew from radiation and micrometeorites. Yet despite this unusual underground setting, the designers still imagined a place that offered some semblance of everyday life. Astronauts preparing meals in a small kitchen, exercising in a gym, or simply relaxing after a long day of exploring. As fantastical as it sounded, the concept had real potential. There was only one problem. To build such a base in the first place, the Soviets needed a way to transport thousands of pounds of equipment and supplies across space. They needed a reliable, super-heavy launch rocket. In the years following the American moon landing, the Soviet Union continued to attempt to launch its massive N-1 missile. Yet every launch failed, with each vehicle falling short before it could even reach orbit. Confidence in the Soviet lunar program began to erode, and the dream of a permanent settlement on the moon felt farther away than ever. However, before scientists could give up the idea, one man still believed he could turn things around. Valentin Glushko had been arguing against the N-1 rocket for years. To him, Sergei Korolev, the man behind the Soviet space program, was holding the nation back by refusing to adopt the highly toxic propellants that Glushko believed would lead the Soviets not only to landing cosmonauts on the moon, but to eventually also reaching Mars and establishing combat stations in orbit. For years, Glushko's projects went nowhere, but as the Soviet lunar program began to collapse, it was suddenly decided that this outspoken engineer might be the country's last chance. In 1974, Glushko was appointed head of NPO Energia, the organization responsible for building many of the Soviet Union spacecraft and launch systems. His first move surprised no one: cancel the disastrous N-1 program once and for all and begin work on a new heavy launch system. The new rocket was called Energia. For its design, the key work principle was simplicity. It used a small number of extremely powerful engines, instead of the nearly 3 dozen that powered the N-1. Its side boosters burned a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen, while the main stage relied on hydrogen fuel, which produced even more energy. These propellants were difficult to handle, but they gave the rocket enormous lifting power, allowing Energia to carry about 100 tons into orbit, slightly more than the failed N-1 ever could. Even more ambitious versions of the rocket were soon proposed. These designs envisioned launchers capable of lifting well over 200 tons into low Earth orbit, or delivering more than 20 tons of equipment directly toward the moon. Glushko appeared so confident in his new rocket that not long after taking control of the Soviet space program, he ordered the development of a fresh concept for a lunar base. The project would be known as Zvezda, or Star. According to surviving reports, the base was imagined as a kind of lunar train, with each module functioning like a separate wagon connected to the others. Some sections would serve as laboratories and control stations, while others would contain living quarters, dining areas, medical rooms, and storage facilities. Each module would be launched separately aboard Energia rockets. Upon landing on the lunar surface, the sections would initially measure about 15 feet in length, but once deployed and expanded to their full size, they would stretch to nearly 28 feet. Unlike earlier concepts for a lunar station, Zvezda was not necessarily intended to remain buried underground. However, designers still envisioned covering parts of the complex with lunar soil to shield the crew. The entire base might even be mounted on a large wheeled chassis, allowing the station to relocate if scientists needed to move to a new research site, or if danger forced the crew to abandon their current position. Plans were even drafted for how such an outpost could operate nearly 250,000 miles from Earth, relying on nuclear power systems that would most likely also be delivered to the moon by Glushko's powerful new rockets. It was an ambitious goal, but when the first Energia launchers were eventually ready for flight, the results suggested Glushko was on the right track to achieve it. Instead of exploding on the launch pad like the N-1 rockets, Energia roared into the sky, successfully sending massive payloads into space, including the Soviet Union's new Buran space shuttle. With a launcher this powerful finally within reach, the idea of sending enough equipment to the moon to build a permanent base no longer seemed like a fantasy. From the other side of the globe, America was watching closely. The days when its space program had been constantly humiliated by the Soviets were gone. Still, the United States could not afford to let its guard down just yet. After the first successful moon landing aboard the American Saturn V rocket, 5 more crewed missions were sent to the lunar surface. Officially, these expeditions were meant to continue scientific research for the Apollo program, yet they also served to send a clear message to the Soviet Union: the moon belongs to America. During Apollo 15, astronauts left their mark across the rugged landscape at the Apennine Mountains on the moon's near side. As they steered the wheel of the lunar roving vehicle, the first vehicle ever driven on the lunar surface. For Apollo 17, NASA sent a crew to the Taurus-Littrow Valley to collect more than 240 pounds of lunar rock and soil, giving America bragging rights as the holder of the largest collection of moon material on Earth. In just 4 years, the nation had gone from trailing in the space race to becoming the most familiar with the moon's surface. And among some scientists and strategists, there was a growing desire to push that advantage even further, before the Soviets could mount a comeback. Werner von Braun, the former German rocket engineer who had become one of NASA's most influential figures, had already been guiding teams studying the feasibility of establishing a permanent American outpost on the moon during the early years of the space program. Unlike the Soviets, who, at least according to the public documents we know today, largely envisioned their lunar base as a scientific hub and a staging ground for future missions deeper into space, some American planners viewed the concept primarily through a military lens. According to a U.S. Army report at the time, a lunar outpost would be, quote, required to develop and protect potential U.S. interests on the moon, to develop techniques in moon-based surveillance of the Earth and space, in operations on the surface of the moon, and for military operations on the moon if required. Plans suggested that the base could be equipped with defensive weapons, including mines designed to puncture enemy spacesuits and unguided rockets armed with low-yield nuclear warheads. A fleet of vehicles would also be stationed there, capable of carrying out reconnaissance missions and search and rescue operations across the moon's surface. However, building said base would be far from easy. Early estimates suggested that at least 147 Saturn-class rockets would be required to launch the equipment needed to begin construction. To make matters even more complex, much of that hardware would first have to be assembled in orbit before being transported to the lunar surface. And by the early 1970s, American officials were beginning to question whether continuing to burden the country with such an elaborate space program was even worth it. The Apollo program alone had cost $25.8 billion, a figure that would exceed $318 billion today when adjusted for inflation. While some analysts argue that the program's technological breakthroughs ultimately produced enormous economic returns, many politicians at the time saw only the price tag and were ready to start making some cuts. In 1973, despite the successful testing of the Nerva nuclear rocket, a propulsion system believed capable of carrying humans to Mars, President Nixon decided to cancel the program and instead prioritize a more conservative project centered on reusable space shuttles. Needless to say, if Americans were no longer going to Mars, they were not setting up a military base on the moon either. The door was suddenly wide open for the Soviets to take the lead once again. But unfortunately for Valentin Glushko and his team back in the USSR, the disenchantment with space exploration and moon colonization was not a trend limited to American politicians. After the Apollo program was officially terminated and the push for aggressive space exploration began to lose steam in the US, many leaders in the USSR reached the same conclusion. If the Americans are not willing to spend billions establishing a lunar base, then why should we? The fact that the nation was also descending into a period of economic decline, later known as the Era of Stagnation, probably didn't help the cause either. While Valentin Glushko and other supporters of the Soviet space program continued pushing for new exploration missions, the Soviet space effort would ultimately stall before scientists managed to place a single boot on the lunar surface. For decades, those ambitions remained dormant, and the years of Soviet dominance in space became only a distant memory. According to some reports, by 2016, Roscosmos was operating at a technological level roughly 9 times behind NASA. However, that's not stopped the nation in recent years from seeking a rematch in the quest to dominate the moon. In late 2023, it was reported that the Moscow-based Institute of Medical and Biological Problems had begun conducting isolation experiments in which commanders, physicians, flight engineers, and researchers were sealed together to simulate the conditions of a lunar mission. And while the war in Ukraine continues to strain Russia's resources, it appears that President Vladimir Putin is still determined to push forward with the country's space ambitions by partnering with a nation that could help it go farther than ever before. Just last year, Russia's Roscosmos and the China National Space Administration signed a cooperation agreement to build the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, a hub planned to be stationed roughly 60 miles from the moon's south pole. According to Roscosmos, the base, quote, will conduct fundamental space research and test technology for long-term uncrewed operations of the ILRS, with the prospect of a human being's presence on the moon. While no definitive timeline has been announced, reports suggest the Russian-Chinese lunar base could become operational sometime in the mid-2030s. Of course, as these plans unfold, the United States will not be standing still. NASA has already launched its first crewed lunar mission since the Apollo era with Artemis II. At the same time, the agency is developing Gateway, the first space station designed to orbit the moon, intended to, quote, return to the moon for scientific discovery and chart a path for the first human missions to Mars and beyond. It may still take years before we know whether these ambitious projects will truly succeed. But one thing already seems clear: a new space race has begun. And the possibility of seeing a permanent base built on the moon is no longer just a forgotten Cold War dream.